Hello everyone, any questions or problems before we start? So in the last lab we started using Python to interact with the database, interact with the SQL databases. Actually using Python you can interact with different kinds of databases, and we were using SQLite 3 library to interact with SQLite databases. And today we are going to start looking at how to create some graphical user interface. And to do that in Python, there are like different ways of doing it with different libraries. And for the labs, we are going to use PySimple GUI. So if you already know some other library to implement a graphical user interface in Python, you can use that library as well. But we are going to use PySimple GUI as a library for user interfaces. So Yeet is asking, are we going to have any quizzes in the lab? So far we did not made any quiz in the lab, and we are not planning to. But if we plan to do a quiz in the lab, we are going to announce it. So you don't need to worry about that. So far we did not have any quizzes in the lab, but in the lecture you had some quizzes. So on the lab homepage, for this lab and for the other lab, we are not going to have some slides because we are going to use directly the Jupyter notebook files. And as in the last lab, we also have this Python version of the equivalent code. But remember, the PY versions are not to run as a whole code. So you should like focus on separate parts in the PY version as well. It's directly converted from this Jupyter notebook file. But if you are using the Jupyter notebook, it's even better. So you can download it. We are going to go through that notebook file. So remember, if you download it, then you need to open up your Jupyter notebook homepage, and in here you can upload that file using this upload option. It's a better or an easier approach, or you can just navigate to your root folder and copy and paste that file there. And we also require this lab3 SQLite database in some of the cells in the Jupyter notebook, just like the last lab we had. So we created some database. So in that we are storing users, companies, and the partner of relationship. So we actually wanted to interact with that database in last lab, and while interacting with that database, this time we would like to create a user interface as well. So the user interface for the user to be able to interact with the database in an easier way. So we are going to show some items, user will be able to choose among them, do some functionality, but in a more useful way, let's say. So in here I'm going to open up this lab5 file, and since we need to use a library, this time this library is not already included in Python. We need to install that library. There are like several ways of doing that. So if the Anaconda distribution is installed on your computer, then like this in that Anaconda folder you also have this PowerShell prompt. This is the command line. So if you open up that command line, you can use the pip command to install some libraries from web. So in this case, we would like to install the PySimple GUI library. You have this pip install command. So if you copy and paste that command to your PowerShell, or let's say the command line, it's going to, if you are connected to the internet, it's going to download that library and install that library for your Python. So this is one option. If some other distribution is installed on your computer, you can like use the command line that you used in there. So in this case, we in the tutorials we show how to install Anaconda. So the Anaconda PowerShell prompt is accessed like this. So since on my system it's already installed, it's saying that okay, the requirement is already satisfied, so there is nothing to do. But in the case that it was not installed, it is going to download and install this library, and then in any Python code you run, you can use that library, you can import that library. So in the Jupyter Notebook file, we remember have some code cells and also some markdown cells. So while a cell is selected under the cell option, you can assign a different cell type. So for the code cells, we are running the code, and for the markdown cells, we are giving some information to the user, to us, to communicate what this code is doing, etc. And so far we just wrote some text, but you can also apply some style to that text. So in here, so if you double click into that markdown cell, you will see that for some of the lines we are using, for example, headers, etc. So the number of hash symbols determine the level of the heading. So you can include some code cells, etc. And so if I run this markdown cell, then it is going to apply that style. So in this notebook file, there are some styling that we do. And if you are wondering how to do that, so there are some links here for the markdown language in Jupyter Notebook, and this second one is more like a summary of it, which items we can use there, etc. So for example, this is given some information. So the number of hash symbols determine which type of header you are writing. So this is like a markup language, so it's kind of similar to HTML. Some of the tags are very similar to HTML, and this other slide also contains some summaries of the things that you can do. So far we already used SQL Lit3 to connect to a database, and if that database was not existing, it creates that database as well. We can run create table statements in here, but we prefer to do that in a more visual way. So SQL Lit Studio was the one that we use in the course. So using SQL Lit Studio, I can create the database, add some data, and then later on I can import that database in my Python program, and now we are going to create some user interface for that program, and we are going to use PySimple GUI. We already installed that library, we already show how to do that, but this is some reference website, let's say. It has some examples that you might need, and there is also the link to the reference which contains all the functionality that we might use there. So for example, in there we are going to create some windows. In a window, which elements do I have, which functions I can call. So this is the complete reference, but in this notebook file we already cover enough of it so that you will be able to create the user interface for your program. So you don't really need to look at this reference, etc. But if you need to use some really fine detail about some elements, if you want to, for example, in here we don't show how to change the color of a font because it's not really a functional requirement, right? We are more interested in what happens when you click on a button, when you type something into a text field, etc. So for such details as coloring, as like putting the elements in a group, etc., there is this reference. But the things that we included in this notebook file is actually enough to implement the whole project. It is going to be enough. So if you are using the Jupyter Notebook to install the library, alternatively you can run the cell as well. So in the Jupyter Notebook, if you use the exclamation mark, it means that you access to the console, so to the command prompt, then you can run any command line programs. So we can pip install PySimple GUI if you are using the Jupyter Notebook as well. But in here the output is the same. It's already installed on this computer. Then we can import it and name it SG. And in here we are going to creates actually windows, so one or multiple windows. So any window that we create here is called actually a window. So sg.window function is going to create that window for you. So you have a string parameter to give a name to that window, so that's going to be written on top of the window, and you need to also pass a layout. So layout is going to be a list of elements that we can put in a layout. So in here I have a list, so with the square brackets, and within any line is again also contained in square brackets. So for now, let me just run to show how it looks. So sometimes when you run it, it might be like hidden, so you may need to make it the full size view to get the window that you just ran. But if you look at, so we have our window, and my first window is written as the title of this window, and actually the elements that I have in the layout are text. So the text element is for giving some information to the user. In this case, we are showing what the user should write in the specific fields. So the name and surname are given as a string parameter to the text item. We have the input item. So the input item is used for receiving some input from the user, usually a typed input. So from the keyboard, user is going to press some keys to type the input. And we are actually not putting some text into the input field, but we are going to actually receive the text from that item. So to receive some text from any of the items, or to receive some value from any of the items, we are going to use keys. So for this input, so I'm creating an input item there, and I assign the key, and the key is any name that I assign, but the keys should be unique within a layout. So in a layout, I'm having this input field, and to access the values of it, I'm going to use this string name underscore input. I have another one here, it's called surname underscore input. And to add a button, you just give the string parameter. It is going to be the text that appears on top of the button. There is also this sg exit element. It is used for putting an exit button there. So it's like a special kind of button. So we fill this layout. Actually, the lines here, so the rows here does not really matter. So for each of these items, I can also put them on separate lines. So if I run it, so the hotkey to run a cell is Control plus enter on your keyboard, it's going to appear the same. For example, if I want to put the name and the area or the input area for the name on the same line, what I need to do is I need to contain two of them within the same square brackets. So within this square bracket, I have text and input. So if I run this one, now the name and the input fields are on the same line. So this is like to have some different layouts. So as long as it's functional and easy to use, you can like apply any different layouts. In here, one important thing is, while the window is on, we have a while loop. So usually this is going to be our program structure. So we have some while loop, and in that while loop, at the first stage, we are going to read the events and values from the window. So values are going to contain any of the elements that has a key. So I can get the user's values for these input fields, and to reach that I'm going to use the keys, use the respective keys. Events are whenever we click on a button. So if we click on one of the buttons, we are going to get the related events. So to showcase that, we are going to here print the events and values. So maybe it's better to print them on separate lines to show it in a better way. So let me actually run this program now and look at the output of it. So far there is no output. So we are in the while loop, but we are trying to read some value from the window, but that's only possible when we click on some of the items here, some of the buttons, for example. So my event in this case is send, since I clicked on the send button. And if we look at the values, so it is a dictionary of elements. So name input and surname input here are the keys of my elements. So these are the keys for my input elements, and their values are empty string for now. But if I type something to one of my input fields, so I will see that, okay, in this dictionary of values, name input maps to this string. So I can get that string, use it any way I want. So this is like a whole string. It also includes the empty spaces there. And which button I click on determines my event. So since I will be able to only click on just one button, it's not a list of events, it's just one event actually. It happens whenever I click one of the buttons. For example, I clicked on the exit button, but while the program terminates, I still have these input values. So let me again run it and show one more thing. One option in a program is to close it using this escape button of the OS, the operating system. If I close it from here, then the event is none and the values is none as well. So there is just one slight difference. If you use the exit button, you can still use these inputs, but if you use the operating system's close button, then you don't actually have those values anymore. So there is just one slight difference. So we said that there is this while loop. At the first phase, we read the event and values. So this printing was just to show you how they look like. Then we can look up our event. So in a window, we most likely have multiple buttons. Which button did we press on? So if we clicked on the send button, so this send should match exactly with the name of the button. If we clicked on the send button, then what we are doing is to print the name and surname of the user using those entered values, but we are printing it onto the output. So we are not showing it using the user interface. So this is like more like debugging what happens. So we are checking the values by printing to the output, and which name I entered there is going to appear next to my string. So in the event that we clicked on the close button, or if the event is equal to exit, so for example here it is the exit button, but the other case is whenever we click on the close window button on the operating system, we are just breaking out of the loop. So in this loop we had while true, and whenever we break, we get out of that while loop, and what we do is to actually close that window. So breaking out of the loop does not directly close it. Window.close function closes it. So that's our first introduction to a window program. And most likely in our application, we need to navigate from one window to another. So let me first run this example. So we have a main window, and from here I can go to window 1. So this is window 1. Here I can go back to the main menu, or I can go to window 2, and in window 2, for example, options are just to go back to the main or to exit the program. So we are able to go through a bunch of windows, and at the end we can exit. How to do such structure? So at the beginning we just create some main window, and in there we have these two buttons to go to window 1 and window 2. And while our loop continues, we read the event and values. So actually we really don't need to use any values here. So this this is here as a formality. So it is also enough to just read the events for us. But so the window.read also returns the values. So we are getting that as well just in case we need to use it, and in our application most likely we most of the time need to use the values as well. Then we are checking our events. So if the button that is clicked is this one, then we close the current window, and with a new layout we create this new layout, and we create a new window with that layout 1. So this is layout 1. So if we click on go to window 2 in any of the windows, so for example let me run it, from window 1 I can go to window 2, or from the main window I can go to window 2. So these are doing the same thing. So therefore I just read the event and go to the window 2. If I needed to do different things, then I can further include some if and else. So if I'm in the window, if I'm in the main window, do this, and if I'm in window 1, do this. So I can do such structure as well. But in this instance, in this example, go to window 2 button does the same thing in every window. What we do is to close the current window, and then we have another layout. So this layout is actually different. There are different buttons, different text there, and we are going to create a new window, and for each of these windows we are using the same variable. Therefore so the window variable is going to be the current window that I have, and whenever I call the close function, it is going to close that current window. In the case that I click on back to main button, I close and create a new layout. So these two lines are actually the same as I did in the beginning, but I need to have a new definition of the layout. So one thing, maybe it feels like natural to do, so I already have the layout, why not just send this layout to here? But one special thing about windows and layouts in PySimple GUI is that you need to have separate layout creation for new windows. So if I would like to create some window with a layout, that layout should not be used by some other window before. So that's why I need to create and assign this layout as well. We cannot reuse existing layouts. So that's one thing to be careful about in such programs, because when you need navigation, when you are going from one window to some other window, most of the time you may need to create the same window multiple times in different cases, in the different scenarios, and you need to have the layout as well there. So the exit button does the same thing. It breaks out of this loop, and then we close the current window, whichever is the current one. At one time we just have one window, so closing that window is enough to end our program. So because of that, so for example I'm creating the layout and the window. It is something that I did as the initial step of the program as well. And if I have like such layouts, so these are actually some simple layouts. If I were to have some very crowded layouts in my if-else statements, it's going to look crowded. So a better approach is going to be to have some functions that are doing that. So for example, wMain function is going to create that layout, create that window, and we are going to return that window because we need to like keep track of this window to close it. So out of the function we just return that window, a reference to that window. So the w1 and w2 functions are doing the same thing, but they are in a function this time. And at the beginning of the function I'm going to just call the wMain function to assign my window, and in the loop what we have is something like this. So whichever these buttons are clicked, we just close the current window, and then we make a new window and put it into our window variable. So for example, in your group project some members could implement some of the functions, and then you can like bring them together and use it in the main loop. And we can pass variables among different windows. So most of the time we are going to do that. For example, in our scenario, we may first log in as some kind of user, and then we may need to remember the ID of that user, remember the name of that user, etc. So for that, we need to pass some parameters between different windows. So let me first run this program. So this is the entrance window. It says, welcome, please enter your name. I need to enter some name here. For example, I enter my name, and then if I click on the enter button, then it is going into a different window. And in this window, I actually see some value that I previously entered. So I can, within this window, I can also update my name. For example, in here, I can write something and click on the update name button. Then this is going to recreate that window for me. So let me get out of there and look what we are doing. So we have two window definitions. So for the first one, this is the entrance one. We have the text displaying the message to the user. We have an input element, and the key is in name for that input element. And we have the enter button and the exit button. And for the other new window, we decided that maybe we can get the username as a parameter. So whenever I want to create some new window that is going to show the username of the user, I just pass the username of that current user as a parameter to this function. And it is going to create some text, and within that text, I need to pass a string, right? This is just receiving some single string. And hello plus username is actually another string. So I can use my parameters to create a new string, and I can pass it to the text. So the user is not going to be able to change this text directly, but in the program, I can use variables to update that text, or I can use some variables while defining that text. We have here an input for the updated name. So if you want to update that name within that same window, we have that one as well. So we are keeping the username as a variable here. We create the entrance window, and while our loop continues, if the user clicks on the enter button, so this is the button in the first window, we are going to get the value from this in name key. So this input area, this input has the key in underscore name. So I'm going to receive the name from here, and I'm going to close this entrance window and create a new window, this time using the wshowInfo function. And I'm going to pass that username to that other function. Therefore, whenever I run this, the name will be there. And in the case that I click on the update name, what we are doing is actually getting the username, this time from the update name input. So it is this one. We close the current window, and then we create a new window with the new username. So we just got the name, the value from there. So that's one option. So I can destroy that window and create a new one that includes the new parameters. But we are also going to see a different way. We are going to see a different way to update existing elements in later examples. So far, one option is to just create that window again with the parameters with the new values. So okay, using input elements, using text elements and buttons, actually we can cover most of the functional requirements. But sometimes we want the user to choose from an existing set of options. And in those cases, actually, if you let the user to type anything, then it could be problematic. For example, in here, maybe we would like to assign one company to one user, let's say. We would like to enter something into the partner of relationship in our database example. And if we are letting the user to decide the IDs directly, maybe those IDs are not in our separate tables. Maybe there is no user with the ID 4 etc. So these will create some problems, and in such cases actually listing the available options to the user is a better idea. To do that, we have list boxes in PySimple GUI. So a list box receives a tuple or a list. So in this example, we are using a tuple, but it can be a list as well. It receives a tuple or a list of strings. So we have some strings there. These are the choices we can have. Since we are going to get some value out of it, we also assign a key to this. And we also determine the size of the element. So we can like get rid of the size as well, so that's not required. But let me first run this example to show what's doing. So I show the list of users to the user, and we can choose one of them, and we know that we can get the value of the chosen item. So that's basically an example about that. And if we choose nothing, then we also know that in the code. So it says you did not choose anything. So let me get rid of the size part. If I don't determine the size, then it's determined by the default values. It might not be that easy to see. So for buttons, for text, and for input elements, we can also assign a size, but the default values for those elements are actually looking better. But in this case, it is not really large enough for me to see all the values. So therefore, most of the time with list boxes, we assign the size. Size has two parameters. So the width of the item and the height of the item. So for example, 40 and 10 can be given as a tuple here. We list the names. If the height is not enough to display all the elements, we can use this arrow symbols to navigate or to go from one element to the other. But if the size is large enough, then it is going to contain all the elements. And in here, what was written was, it was saying, okay, we can get the length of choices if we want to show all four of them at the same time. And if I were to like include some other user, then it's going to be in correct size, let's say. So we also assign the key. If we did not assign the key, then we cannot get the value, right? So assigning key is for getting the specific values. We also have this OK button there. We create the window, and while our loop continues, if we click on the OK button, what we are doing is to get the value for the chosen name. And let's actually look at the output when we print the values here to see what's happening there. So I'm going to click on OK. I see that, okay, for chosen name key, we have a list. We have an empty list. We did not choose anything. For example, if I choose James, then in that list, I have only James. For example, if I choose something else, I have Jill in that list. So one thing about list boxes is that they return a list of objects. Because if we go through the settings of a list box, we can allow the user to choose multiple rows of a list box. So by default, I cannot choose multiple rows here, even if I like combine it with some keyboard characters. So if I shift click, for example, it doesn't choose multiple things, etc. By the default settings of a list box, I can only choose one element, but it is also possible to mess with the settings so that we can choose multiple elements. And as a result of that, the list box returns a list of values. And if we are just using a single value, we need to like look at the index 0 of it. If the list is empty, nothing is chosen. So in here, we say if values chosen name. So this means that something is selected, something is chosen. So I can also say that length of this values chosen name equals to 0 to find that you did not choose anything. So if the user chose something, we are inside this if part. But if this is nothing, if this is empty, then we are going into the else part, saying that you did not choose anything. And one option to show a pop-up window, we have this pop-up function. So if I run it, now let me show, if I choose one value, if I click on OK, this is the pop-up window. In the pop-up window, actually, we have a text message to the user. So we are using it to inform the user about something. We have the OK button to close the window. So we can also close it through the cross mark there. And as a single parameter, we give the text message to the pop-up window. So in here, since value's chosen name is not empty, so it is guaranteed to be not empty because we are inside this if part, I can get the element that is in index 0. So it's actually the only chosen element. So we have just one element in that list that is selected, but we are going to refer to it using this index 0. So for example, if I lose the index 0, then if I try to get that value, then it's going to say that I cannot concatenate a string with a list. We are actually giving the list element. So we need to reference the zeroth index in that case. So sometimes you are going to crash the programs. So my program actually crashed. So I can like interrupt this kernel, but this window is still there. So this window is actually using something from your operating system. Therefore, it did not went away when my program crashed. So there is something going wrong with this window, but I also need to close this window from my operating system. So that's one thing. So if your program crashes, interrupting the kernel, restarting the kernel is something, and closing or like forcing close on the window that was open is something else. So these are two separate things. So now let me bring that index 0 there, because this one will be a string, otherwise it's a list. We also have the combo element. It's very similar to listbox actually, but the difference is that with combo items, with combo elements, we show one row at a time. So this is the same code, we just switch to combo. So I can choose James, so the functionality is the same, but actually I'm not showing all the lines at the same time. I'm using this triangle button to choose one of the existing items. And the difference is that, so if I look at the output, so this is the same output, we are printing the values. For the combo item, we use the chosen name key. So for that key, actually just one value is assigned, one string is matched. So in the other example, it was a list, but if I use a combo, it is going to be the string directly, because in a combo box, there is no possibility to choose multiple elements. In the list box, by default, we choose one element, but if we look at the settings, there is option to choose multiple elements. In a combo, the only option is to choose one element. So therefore, it is mapped, its value is mapped directly to the string that you include in that combo element. So the difference is that here, for the values, there is no indexing because it's not a list, it's directly the value that you contain in that item. So now we would like to use some interaction with our database. So again, we are going to use lab3.db. That should be in our folder. So I'm going to look at that it's there. Otherwise, I need to download it and I need to upload it to my homepage or the directory that I'm working on. So in here, we are going to use the to thing. So I need the SQL lit3 to interact with the database. I need PySimple GUI to create my interface, user interface. So we connect to that database. In this program, I would like to list my users, list my companies as well. And I want to choose one company and one user to assign that user as a partner of the selected company. So I actually would like to do multiple things. One is showing information. So in last lab, we saw how to use our current connection to execute SQL queries. So in this case, this is my SQL query. We project ID, name, surname from the user table. And then I store the values in a list, in a users list. And I actually concatenate this as a tuple. So in my users list, there are going to be a bunch of tuples. And for a tuple, the index 0 is going to be ID of that user, index 1 is going to be name, and index 2 the surname of the user. And for the companies as well, we do a similar thing. So I'm actually not projecting everything from the user table. I really don't need to have the date of birth, for example, in this use case scenario. I only get the ones that I need to use. And most of the time, if the user is going to choose some value, you need the primary key, right? To choose one unique row, to choose one unique entry, I need to have the primary key. So I'm getting the company names and the CIDs from the company table. I have my companies list. So I form these two lists, and in my layout, I can give these lists to the combo elements. And for these combo elements, I also have a key. So when user chooses something from these combos, I'm going to get the value out of it. And there is the button to assign the user to the company as a partner. So for now, let me just run it. So I have this choose a user combo, and in here I have the list of all the existing users in my database. And I'm going to choose one of them. I'm going to also look at the companies. So these are the companies with their IDs and the name of the companies. So then I will be able to assign the user as a partner of the selected company. So how to get the values? Actually, whenever we click on this assign as a partner button, what we do is to get the values first. So from my combo called choosing user and choosing company, I'm going to get the value, and that value can be empty as well. Remember, if the user did not choose anything, that value is going to be empty, and if I assume that it is going to be filled, then our program is going to crash because we are trying to use some non-existing value. So we need to do some checks in order to be sure that I can use that value. So the first check is going to be to look whether users shows something or not. So actually we have the user table and the user that interacts with our program. So these are like two different objects. We look at the user line. If it is empty, we are going to say to the user with this pop-up window, so the message is going to be, please choose a user if you did not. So we are going to also look at the company line, so it is this one. So we could have just directly written there as well, like this. So we really don't need to use the parameters, but using like some variable for it may make it more readable. That's why we are using the naming convention in this example. So we look at those two lines. If the user did not choose something, then he should choose it. But else, in the else part, it is guaranteed that user line is not empty, company line is not empty. So we have this if, elif, else structure. In this else part, these are chosen. So the user chose some value for these two. Then I'm going to get the value that I would like from the zeroth index, because remember, for each of these elements in my list, I have multiple values. So I have ID, name, and surname from the user. Actually, in here, it could be wise to print the values as well. So let me do the printing. But I need to click on the assign as partner button. So I need to click on some button. So the right now chosen user and chosen company are both empty. But if I choose a user, then for that chosen user, okay, this is a combo, but we gave a list of tuples. That's why this is a tuple. So if we use the list box, it is going to be a list of tuples, but this time this is just single tuple. But from here, I have the ID, name, and surname information. And I'm going to get the one that I'm interested in. So for the user, it's going to be the user ID, because I would like to assign this user to that company. So I need to insert something into the partner of table, and in the partner of table, I need to have the user ID and the company ID. So I get the user ID, and similarly from that company combo, I get the company ID. But one more thing is, before trying to insert this new row, I need to first check whether this user is already assigned to that company or not. Because otherwise, I will get an error from the database saying that, okay, the primary key should be unique, but you are trying to insert the same primary key again, because this user is already assigned to that company. So for such things, I may need to make some checks first. And my check is going to be to find out whether this user ID and company ID combination is already in the partner of table or not. So this is going to be my query. So select everything, or it could be just one attribute as well. In here, I'm not really interested in the value. I'm more interested in the count of such examples. I can also use a function, but what I'm interested in is that is there at least one value that returns out of this SQL query. So therefore I just wrote select star, but it could be just one single attribute, or I can also find the count of those attributes in here as well. So from the partner of table, and the condition is for user ID to be equal to this parameter. So in the last lab we have seen that we need to give the tuple that is going to replace each of the question marks within my SQL string. So the first question mark will be replaced with the user ID, and the second question mark will be replaced with the company ID. And remember, if it was just single question mark, I still need to give the second parameter as a tuple. It expects a tuple. But in this case, I have two values there replaced by user ID and company ID. And I'm going to use the fetch one function. So I execute the query, it returned some results, maybe none. I'm going to try to fetch one of them to the row, and I'm going to look whether row is none or not. So if the row is none, meaning that this query did not return anything, then that means that we can successfully insert this new entry. This user can be assigned to that company. If the row is not empty, then that means that we cannot insert this user. Then in this else part, what we are doing is we are showing, okay, the user ID is this one, but that user is already assigned to that company ID. So we already know that user ID and company ID are existing users' IDs. So this user ID is an existing user. The company ID corresponds to an existing company. But these two are already in the partner of table. But if we do not get any rows from this SQL query, then that means that we can insert such user. Then we are just going to call the execute query, and the values will be replaced by user ID and company ID in order. So we get out of this loop whenever we click on the window closed button. We close the window and we close the connection to the database as well. And in here, if we are making changes, we need to also commit our changes, remember. So to apply the changes to our database, you need to commit those changes. So I added the commit line there. So let me choose one user, for example, number 2, and number 2 company, assign as a partner. So it's successfully inserted these two values. And let me try to assign it again. So this time it's going to say that the user ID 2 is already assigned to company ID 2. So we just inserted it because of that. So let me choose some other combination. For example, this is assigned to company, but I guess 1 combination was already in the partner of table, but it was not. Okay, then I guess this user, okay, is already assigned to company 3. This is not something that I just did. It was something that we did before in this database, and we assigned it we cannot assign that because it's already in the partner of table. And since we commit the changes, if I close that window and if I open that window again, if I try to assign 2, then it's going to say that this is already assigned. So if I was testing, I would get rid of the commit line to test different combinations. Then if I'm using, then I'm going to include the commit line as well to keep the changes, to keep the insertion, deletion, and update statements on my database. So now let's give a break, 10 minutes break. If you have questions, you can ask them. Otherwise, let's give a 10 minutes break and continue at 2:30. Any questions, problems before we start? Okay, in this example, this time we also interact with the database, get some information from the database, show it to the user, and then this time user chooses some values there. We look at the values. If it is applicable, we do some function on the database. And in such examples, we need to check multiple things. So if we are inserting into the database, the attributes should be in correct type. For example, if we need to insert a date value, we have the specific format. If we need to insert a number, it should not contain any letters, any empty spaces, etc. If we would like to create some entry to a table, then not null attributes should be filled. So if some attribute is required, I cannot leave it empty. And before trying to insert such data, we can give messages to the user, for example. We know that whenever we try to insert a new partner of entry, we have to have the user ID and have to have the company ID. Therefore, we can make our checks and give some information to the user. These are like messages to the user to do the correct thing. And then at the end, we try to insert it. And while trying to insert it, actually we know that this insert will succeed because we already checked that user ID and company ID are not null. They have some correct values, and we already know that it's not already inserted into the partner of table. Then we can execute it and show the success message to the user. So we should not have any primary key conflicts. So there we actually check whether the same primary key is already in the table or not. We also should satisfy the foreign key constraints. So in here we give a list of users and a list of companies that are possible to choose. So since we give the list to the user is going to choose among them. They are guaranteed to satisfy these foreign key constraints. So for this one, since we are using list box or a combo element, this is already satisfied actually. So therefore, instead of using an input directly, if we need to have some foreign key relations there, we actually use the combo or list box elements. So since this was a markup cell, I double clicked on it and it showed the the original version of it. If you need to bullet point items, you have you can write a dash and then follow it by a space character to put a bullet item there. So now let's look at the other example. So I'm going to first run the cell to show it what's doing. So in here we would like to actually insert a new user, and to create a new user entry I need name, surname, credit, status and date of birth. And for the city was not required. City is not null. City is not null. So it can be empty or not to create a new user, but the other attributes should be satisfied. They should be given. They have the not null constraint. And for some of the items, we have special constraints, right? For the credit, it should be a number. Date of birth should have some specific type. And for the status, for example, if we would like to only allow some specific values for the status, we can use a combo item in this place. And remember, we also need an ID for the user, but we did not give the option to enter the ID for the user. We are going to find out the next available ID in the code itself. So let's look at the code. So the status options are here as a list. So it can be a tuple as well. For the sake of example, we use the list for this one. We make the connection to the database. We define our layout. In our layout, we have multiple rows or of elements. So on the first row, these two are our items, we have the text and the input, and on the left part we most of the time have the text to give information to the user. What should we write into that part? We also include the size for the text element to have a better alignment. So let me just get rid of the size elements for now to show what happens. So if I'm not assigning the size, then these will be just in enough size to fit those letters in it. Then it might be not looking so good. So those sizes for the text are there to keep the second elements aligned as well. So these are left aligned. So we have some empty spaces to keep the layout in a better shape. So for each of these inputs, we have assigned some keys. For the combo, we give the status options, and we are going to get the result using the status key. For date of birth, we are using some special button. So this is a regular input. So in here, I have the input key is date of birth, but other than that, it's similar to what I have for name and surname. So the user can write anything there as well. The difference is that I put a special button next to it just after that. And that special button actually, when it's clicked, it opens up a calendar. And from this calendar, I can choose any date. And that date is going to be put into the input item that's just before this special button. So I can choose that and like change the dates, etc. It's in the correct format. I can still edit that, but that button is going to show us a calendar. So let me show the code for that. So this is the calendar button. On the same row, so these should be within the same square brackets. If I include a calendar button, I also include a format here. So let's test what happens if I don't include the formats. Then it is going to keep the full date in the type that it is defined for. So this is actually also containing the time. But since we are using it for SQL databases, the format is going to be the same always. So you can just reuse this calendar button. Whenever the user chooses some dates from the calendar, it's going to replace this item's value. So it is the item that's just before our calendar button. So for example, in the case that we did not have an input part there, then this is going to actually replace my text. So which is not very meaningful. That's why we just included an input just before the calendar button. So we also have an input for the city, and in here we actually want to check the values, so whether they are empty or not. For some of the input fields, they should contain specific values. For example, the name cannot be empty. In here we can directly write values name as well, but in the end we are going to keep them as a tuple. So I can do this, or instead I can just gather all the parameters as a tuple. So these are all the parameters in order. If I need to insert them into the user table, I need to just include the ID as the first index element. Otherwise, these are in order of insertion to my user table. For some of the parameters, they should be not null. So I'm checking whether they are null or not, they are empty or not. So for the second parameter, which is the credit, it should be also numeric. So I have this numeric check. So I'm using the function for the string is numeric. If it is numeric, then it has the correct value, but in this case I'm saying not numeric, so I include the not keyword here. So it is going to enter this elif part if the credit is not numeric. So in that case we show a message saying that it should be a numeric value. So we also do the similar thing for status and date of birth. And since for the date of birth, if the user uses the calendar button, then it's going to be in the correct format. So we did not have any additional checks for that. But then we would like to find out the next available ID. So instead of asking the user to enter the ID, we just use we actually try to generate the next available ID. So if we ask the user to enter the ID, then we may need to check whether that ID is already existing in our database or not. So let's say we make the check, okay, we ask for the ID, the user types some ID, that's not acceptable, it's going to say that. Maybe, okay, the user changes the ID to some other value, but those other values can be also not acceptable. So generating the IDs automatically is a better idea usually, because you really don't keep the user busy with determining some possible valid ID for that table. So in this case, the primary key is like only used for finding that user. So for this user, the ID does not really come from something like a social security number. So for example, if this was the social security number, then we have to ask for the user to enter it, because otherwise if we auto-generate it in some other like real life example, there is the real social security number that belongs to that person. So in that case, we cannot auto-generate the primary key, for example, but in some cases we can. So this is one of those cases. This ID does not have any correspondence in the real world, so we just auto-generate it. And to find the next available ID, what we are doing is from the user table, we look at the ID attribute, ID column. Among them, we choose the maximum value. And the next available ID is going to be actually maximum plus 1. So in here, we execute this query, we fetch one result. Since this is returning just one value, because it is the result of the function, we are getting from the 0th index the maximum ID. We just add it, we just increment it by 1, and this is called the new ID. And for the parameters, since while we are executing an SQL query, the question marks will be replaced by a tuple. I formed the tuple. So we actually formed the tuple earlier with our parameters. We just need to append this new ID. So this is a tuple, this is a tuple. It's going to create a new tuple out of these two elements, where the new ID is the first element, and then it's followed by these parameters. So in this case, we can insert such user, and when we insert something, when we change something on the database, it's usually a good idea to show error or success messages to the user as well, because if I click on a button, if nothing is showing up, it might be doing something on the background to the database, but if I'm not seeing anything, then I might think that nothing is happening. So let me run this. So in this case, if I try to insert, then it's going to first say name cannot be empty. So even if I enter some value to some of the other fields, I need to first satisfy the name condition, because we use an if-elif structure to make those checks. So let's put the name there, then it's going to say surname cannot be empty. Let's also put that. So credit cannot be empty. Let me write some weird values for the credit. Then it's going to say that credit should be numeric, and numeric meaning that it should not also contain any empty spaces. So if it contains some empty spaces, then it is also not numeric. So I'm going to just writes a numeric value. Then the status cannot be empty. Let me choose some status. Then date of birth cannot be empty. Let's choose a date of birth. And then city actually can be empty. So we don't have a check for city because it doesn't have a not null constraint. I can insert this new user. So it says successfully inserted Ali with ID 21. So if I try to insert it again, then this is going to insert a new entry with these values, but this time the ID is going to be 22. So it's always insert some new entry, given that I have the attributes there. We can have the city as well, so we can insert it as a new user. Of course, we can like change the name, etc., and use it with different values as well. So I'm going out of this one. So when we break out of the loop, we commit our changes, so that user should be in my database now. So for example, if I go to other cell and look up our users, so these users are there. So for each time I clicked on the insertion button, so 3 times for this one, and at the last one we renamed that person as Jane. So these are there. I can assign a company to them, for example. So now in this next example, we may need to sometimes update a list or any of the item according to the choice of the user in the same window. So let me actually first run this example. So here I have the list of users. So for example, I choose one of the users. Then whenever I click on the list partner companies button, I would like to list the companies that this user is a partner of. So for example, if I change the user, then the list of companies should also change. So for example, for some of the users that will be one company, but for Jane, I guess there is no company. But for one of these Alice, it was this one, I guess, we assigned one partner company and it's there. So in this case, whenever I click on this button, we do not recreate this window. We actually update an element within this window. So let's look at how to do it. At the beginning, we have a list of users. We append the users information from the database using this SQL query. We also keep a list of companies, but we do not fill this company list at the beginning. So this is our layout. We have the combo for user. So at one time we are choosing one value and while displaying it on the page. So let me run it again. So I can display all the users, but once one of them is selected, then I can only see one of them. The list box is different, such that we see multiple rows at the same time always, without needing to show the options that we can choose there. So we have the combine list box to do that task. We have the button here as well. And whenever we click on the list partner companies button, what we are going to do is to get the user ID. Actually in here we did not include a check for the whether you choose something or not. So therefore, if I click on this, it's going to crash. It's going to say that, okay, you are trying to get the index 0, but it's out of range. There is no index 0. There is no user selected. So I need to close this window, and on the code I may need to actually, it automatically restarts the kernel, I think, since it crashed, since it caused a crash outside of this part. So it is not just a syntax error, right? It's some error that caused my window to crash. So that's why it automatically restarts the kernel as well. And in here, let's look what we are doing. So we can also include here, for example, if we clicked on the list partner user companies, and if this is not empty, then let's do these. So that will be better. And otherwise in here we can say that, okay, sg.popup, you should select a user, for example. In here you can do that. So in this case, it is not going to crash. It is going to say that you should select a user, and then the user should select some user there. What we are doing, okay, given that a user is selected there, we get the ID of that user, because in the 0 index we keep the IDs. So that's the order is because of our query. So if we change the order in the query, we should also fix the order in our list as well. So we get the user ID. Now we would like to fill the companies list using a query. And in that query, what we are doing is actually from the partner of and company tables, we join these two tables through the CID. So CID in the company table should be equal to the company ID in the partner of table. And the other condition is this should be for the given user ID. And that user ID is the user ID that we get from the chosen user. And for such companies, we get the CID company name and the monthly payments. And we keep those companies in this list. Then while our window is still open, we can update the values of an element. So to access an element, we write window.theElement function, and the parameter is going to be the key of that element. So remember, to get the values, we were using keys, and to get the element itself, we can also use the key. In this case, the key of this list box is called company. So I'm going to get it using this key. And then I'm going to use the update function. So at the beginning, the first parameter of a list box is its values. So in here, for example, if I write values, so actually, let me do it for the combo because the company's list is already empty. But for combo, if I write values equals to users, it's going to fill the values of this item using this list. So while updating, I need to explicitly say what I'm updating. This time I'm saying, okay, values of this element is going to be the company's list. And at each time, since I initialize companies to the empty list, it is going to only show the companies that this user is a partner of. So if I was not initializing it to the empty list, then what it does is each time I run it, it's going to append it to the list. Maybe this is some functionality that I need to have in some other place, but in this instance, I need to initialize the company's list to the empty list so that whenever, multiple times if I run it, it's going to show only the companies that this user is a partner of. So this example is actually doing that. So now let's have another example, and in this example, what we would like to do is to send some credit from one user to some other user. So in here I have a list of users. For example, let's choose Marta, and on that other side let's choose one other user, and maybe the amount that we would like to send is 500, let's say. So Marta has 750. After I send, so it says successfully send, if I check Marta, Marta now has 250, and we send to Paula, now Paula has more money. So this is going to be the functionality that we want to have. And some checks that we need to do. So for example, if I don't choose a user, then I need to choose a user for this part. For the receiver part, I need to choose a receiver as well. If these two are the same people, actually, I guess we are first making the amount check. For example, in here, let's write some amount there. But we also check whether we are trying to send to ourselves or not. So we cannot send to self. Let's say we are showing that message. Actually, it is possible to like decrement the amount and increase the amount to the same user, but it's not very meaningful, so we don't want to have some meaningless functionality there as well. And the amount should be numeric. I guess we are not checking it in the code, but that's some check that we can include. But one more check is that the value that we are entering here should be positive, right? Amount should be positive. If I enter a negative value there, or I may try to put some amount that's higher than my current credits. So in this case, it's going to say insufficient credits. So these are the functionality that we try to achieve in this example. So again, we have a list of users, and using the same approach, we get the users from our database. And then in the layout, we have two combo. And in this combo, we use the same users list. So for the receiver and the sender, they are going to be the same user list, but we assign different keys to these combos. So actually it is not possible to have the same key. So if you try to have the same key, it's going to say that, okay, duplicate key found in your layout. So there is some error, it's going to say. So you need to have different keys for each of your items. We have the input, and the key for that is amount. So whenever the user clicks on the send button, we get the from user and to user values, and we check whether they are empty or not. If this one is empty, we are going to say, okay, you need to choose the from user, the sender, and the receiver part is called to in here. You need to also enter some amount, and in here you can also have one more check to say that the amount is numeric, right? That's also some possible thing. The user might have some empty spaces, and if you include such thing, then in here we are also like trying to convert this amount into an integer. This will fail if this is not a numeric data. So we need to be careful about multiple things while doing this. And then, given that the from and to users are selected, we get the ID values from index 0. So this is to get the ID of these users, because we are going to find them or use them through their IDs, through their primary keys. If their primary key was multiple attributes, then we need those multiple attributes. So if these two IDs are the same, then we are displaying a message saying that you cannot send to self. So because of the design of this if-else structure, we first check the amount, but for this cannot send to self check, we can also include it in the other level, in this level as well. So that's something like a design choice you might make. So that's why whenever I choose the same person for these from and to areas, whenever I click on send, it first asks to enter the amount, and given the amount exists, then it checks whether I can send it to self or not. Then I convert the amount to an integer, because anything that I input from the keyboard for the input elements is going to be a string. If I need to use it as a number, I need to convert it to a numeric type. Then I check whether it is positive or not. If it is not, I display the message. If it is positive, I also need to check whether it is larger than the sender's credit or not. So for that check, I need some information from the database. In here, I actually already have the credit for a user, right? I already put it into a list. But for some dynamic elements, like the credit amount, it's a better idea to get the latest value from the database itself. So for example, I might run this program, and this window gets the data at this initial stage, so it fills the users list, but then I could keep this open for days, and at some time I might say, okay, let's send money to Paula, and maybe I use money in some other application. So my original credit is stored in the database. The correct version is in the database, but on the application side, it might not be updated because we just at the beginning get the data, for example. Because of such cases, if I'm using this value in my application directly, it might be not that very meaningful. So that's why we actually have some SQL query to get the current credits from the database. So for this from user ID, let's find the credits. So we just fetch one, because there's only one user with this matching ID. And for that user, we are only getting the credit amount. This is a number, so it is the credit of from user. So we keep that in that variable. And we check whether this is less than the amount that we try to send. In this case, we are going to say insufficient credits. But if it is not less than the amount that we enter there, we would like to send the amount to the target user. So we actually need to execute two update queries. So with one query we cannot do this transaction, right? We cannot at the same time decrease one of them and increase one of them. So we need to execute two queries, and this should be like done at not at the same time, but if I'm decreasing money from the sender, I should increase that amount to the receiver. These two can be in different order, but let's say if one of them fails, I should not do the other one. So in here you might have some commit code given that these two succeed. So our order here is not that important, but for example, instead of committing the changes at the last stage, I can include the commit part here, and this is going to only achieved if these execute queries are succeeding. So I need to run multiple queries, and if one of them fails, actually I don't want to commit the changes. So we can commit the changes only when these two executed. So in our project in this class, that's not that really important, but in the real life examples, actually there are some transaction modelings. In the lectures you are going to also see them to keep the integrity of the database. So for example, multiple applications could be using the credit amount, so we should be always like using that current amount of the credit, the updated version of the credits. So we execute these two queries to decrement and to decrease and increase the credit of the from user in the first one and to user in the second one. The only thing that changes is the user's IDs and the sign of the operation. So in one case we decrease the credit by this amount, and on the other one we increase it by the same amount, and we give information to the user, okay, successfully sent this amount from this user to that user. And then at the last stage we actually need to update the user lists. Otherwise, if I don't update the user lists, so let me actually do that first. So let me get rid of the part that okay, I did the wrong thing, sorry about that. I just by mistake hit Ctrl R, which is I guess for restarting. Let me go back to that part. We were here. And that was the code that we have here. So let me get rid of that. So this time I run it, Control plus Enter from the keyboard. For example, let's say from Paula, I would like to send to Brandon. Let's send 1,000. So we sent success messages there. If I'm not updating the lists, then for Paula I'm going to see the previous value, thinking that maybe I can send 100 more to Wayne, but it's not going to succeed because the credits are not enough. So for Paula I left 20 actually, but in the list it's not directly updated. So I can send 20 more. If I rerun the program, then now I'm going to see Paula has no more. But after an operation, if I want to update the list, then I'm going to create the user list again. So user list is initialized to empty list, and then I get the latest values from the database. And then I would like to update the values of these two elements. So for these combo elements, I'm updating the values to be equal to users list. And for this one, I also clear the amount. So this is If I'm not doing that, for example, let's say I send from one person to the other person some amount, we successfully sent, the amount will still be there. So that's again some design choice. If I want to clear that amount, then I need to get that item. So that item was an input element called amount. So the key of that element was amount, and I update the value of it. So for an input element, the value is value. There is no s there. But for list box and combo box, for combo and list box elements, we use the values. So that's one difference there. So most of the time for such scenarios like sending credits, money, etc., we actually don't choose the sender, we actually log in as the sender. And in this example, we are going to have such example. So let's say we would like to log in as a user. In this database, we do not store a password. So we decided to use the combination of ID and the name. So for example, I want to log in as user ID 1. To log in, I need to know my name. So if I write some weird name here, it's going to say that there is no such user. This is not you. So I need to know the name and the ID at the same time. For the usual login scenario, this is like the username plus the password. But in this database, there was not a password attribute. So we are using the combination of these two things. If this was not a combination, then I would be able to log in as any of the users. But I need to know the name and the ID at the same time. Then I log in as William, for example. William is with ID 1. And when I log in, it is going to show me my credits here. I'm going to choose some user. I can send some amount. It's going to update my current credit amount as well. Then I can log out and log in as some other user, for example. And it's going to show the credit for that user. So Paula has no more money. And while choosing the to user, the receiver, we are not showing the user that we log in as in here. So for example, we log in as ID2, so ID2 is not listed here. So it's more useful in that case. So let's look at the example code. So in here, we have two windows, one for login, one for sending money. And sending money is actually very similar to the previous example. But to login, we have the username and user ID inputs. And if I click on the login button, I'm going to get those values. And if one of them is empty, I'm going to say, okay, missing user ID or missing name, you should enter that value. But if both are filled, I'm going to execute this query, trying to find such user with the equal ID and name. So the user ID is already given, the user types it there, but I try to find that ID in my table. So I fetch one result. If there is such a user, it's going to contain some value. This row will not be empty. But if this row is none, then we are going to say that no such user. With this ID and name combination, I cannot find a user. If it contains something, then that means this ID and that name is correct. And we are going to get the login ID from there. So login ID is a variable that's outside my loop. So at the beginning, it's initialized to -1, meaning that it's not a correct user, maybe. So that's some ID that's not existing in my table. But then if I'm able to find such user, I'm going to keep the ID of that user in that variable. And then we are saying welcome with the username. So the username is the username that user wrote there. I can get it from the database as well. So I know how to fetch data from the database. But since this is the matching one, I can directly use the same username. So we close that window and we are going to open a new one. And in that new window, this is actually similar to the last example where we have the send functionality. We need the user list, right? A list of users to choose the receiver. And because of that, we need to fill a users list. And one additional thing here, we do not want to display ourselves as the user that we log in as in that receiver list. So while getting the values for this receiver list, we also have a condition saying that the ID of the user that I'm getting should be different than the login ID that I have. So I'm not going to show myself as a receiver. So we would like to get a new window here. And this time we are not going to have a combo for the sender. Sender is going to be the one that contains the login ID. And in here we would like to show the current credit amount. So I have a text to show the current credit amount. And the current credit amount is going to be this login credit. So with a query for the login ID user, I find the current credit and I assign it to this login credit variable. For my text next to the current credit, I display this login credit, but I'm doing one more thing. I'm assigning a key to a text. So far we did not assign a key to a text because text is for giving information to the user, right? So user ID, I'm not able to write something for this text element. I can fill the input element. So these are the input elements. I am not able to fill the text element, but in this example, I'm going to update the value of the text element. So because of that, to update some value of an element, I need to assign the key as well. So that's why we assign the key to the text element here. So we are going to update its value in the loop. So let's look at what we are doing. If we click on the send button, so actually this functionality is same with the previous cell. So we get the receiver's ID. Receiver's ID should be filled, but this time we are not keeping the ID of the sender in a separate way, right? The ID of the sender that's already the user that we log in as. So the to user, for that we get the ID. We do the check for the amount. So the checks for the amount is the same. Amount should be positive. The from user's credit, so the sender's credit, we need to get it from the database, but this time using the login ID of this user. It should be less than the amount that we enter there. The two update queries are the same, except for in here this time for the sender we are using the login ID. And then we need to update the user lists. We are doing the same thing where the ID of the users is different than the login ID, so as not to show the login user within that list. And we clear the amount. And similar to how we clear the amount, this time we also would like to update the credit, update the user's credit on the screen. So these lines are for finding the current credit, right? We actually have those same lines here. So we are able to find the credit of this login user, but that credit will change after these update queries. So therefore we need to get the last value of it, most recent value of it. And from my window, I get the login credits element, which is a text actually. I'm going to update its value to be equal to this login credit as a string. So login credit is actually a number. We convert it to a string to put it into our text. But this is how we did that. So if we click on the logout button, what we do is to close this current window and open the login window again. And this is the functionality of that. So actually this is like a similar scenario to what you might have in your project descriptions. And in this last cell, we are doing the same thing. So if I run this, the functionality is the same. So for example, missing username, I put William here. I'm able to log in as William. I can choose someone, send some money to them, credit is updated, send some different money to somebody else, etc. I'm able to log out and enter as some other user, etc. The functionality is the same in this last cell, but we are using functions to create the windows and also to do the functionality. So in here we are reusing the code actually in a more readable way. So to create the login window, this is our layout. To create the send window, we actually need a list of users. So we get the list of users from the database. And then for the login user, we get the credit amount because we are going to use this login credit in our text to give information to the user. But then at the end, we create and return that window. Whenever we click on a button, we are doing the same operations. But this time, for some of the variables, you might need to use them as global variables. So in this earlier example, since everything is in the same place, we don't really need to pass parameters or use global variables. But in the other example, if you are going to include the functionality as a function, then you may need to be careful about the parameters. For example, I'm not passing any parameter to this button. Therefore, this button is going to use the global variables if I'm just using the value of those variables. But it is going to, for example, if I'm doing assignments, I need to be careful, right? So that's one thing. So user ID here is a local variable. So it's going to, since I'm assigning user ID to some value, it's going to act as a local variable here. For values, it's going to use the global variable because values is not predefined within this function before. It's going to use the values that I have in my loop. So maybe it's better to look at the loop at the first part. So I assign my login ID as 9s1. I create the login window, and while my loop continues, if the user clicks on the login button, I call the login button function. If the user clicks on the send button, I call the respective function. So in the case that I log out, I close the window here and then create a new window. So for logout, I need to close this window and then get the new window and make the assignment. But for other button presses, I'm not switching the windows. I'm not closing and opening different windows. I just call that function. And when we break out of the loop, we just close the window. So in here, I read the values, right? Within the loop, I read the values. But one option is to pass values to the required buttons or functions of the buttons. But the other option is to use the global variables directly. So within the function, if something is not defined, it's going to use the global version of it. If I'm assigning some value, then it's going to be a local variable. So user ID in this case is a local variable. And then I use the user ID in this position, for example. And once we get out of this function, it will be done. I don't have any more access to user ID. But for some of the assignments, for example, in here, I make an assignment for the window. If I'm assigning its value to something else, it's going to think that this should be a local variable, but I need to explicitly say that window variable is the global one. So the one that I'm using here is going to be the global one. So for changing the login ID that I have out of my loop, for example, I have this login ID, and within the different functions, I need to use the same login ID. So as a result, we also say that login ID is going to be a global variable because we make an assignment for this login ID. If I don't say these two are global here, then they are going to be declared locally, and I don't have access to the one that's outside my function. So if you are putting things in functions, you need to be careful about such things. So these are like more Python related things. So the variables, you might pass them as variables, then whether they are passed by reference or by value you need to be careful about, or you can use them as global variables, and in that case you need to like explicitly say which one of these are the global variables. For example, if we click on the button send, so this is the same functionality that we have in the previous cell. We just put it into the function, and the thing that we need to be careful about is the global variables and whether we pass some parameters to the functions or not. So if you have any questions you can ask, and otherwise that's it for this lab. And in the next lab we are going to have a more complete example for the database where we had students, teachers enrolling to courses, etc. So for that database we are going to have a complete example, but so far what we have seen is actually enough to implement the whole project. So for the project you are going to have some user interface. For example, you are going to log in as a user, and for some functionality you will have, for example, some other windows, and in here I might insert a user, enroll to a class, etc. So for the functionality we expect such things, and this information is actually enough, and in the next lab we are going to have a more like a complete example of it. So that's it for today. See you later.